Canada and India are entering a new phase of diplomatic cooperation, and this is no coincidence. Both countries are facing pressure from the same source. This week, Donald Trump's administration imposed a 50% tariff on India's exports, adding significant strain on its economy. At the same time, Ottawa appointed a new ambassador to New Delhi, a move seen as an important step toward easing tensions, after Canadian officials had previously accused the Indian government of involvement in assassinations and extortion on Canadian soil. On the surface, the two events may appear unrelated, but in reality, they are closely connected within a shared strategy. Confronted with pressure from Washington, both Canada and India have strong incentives to seek each other out, find common ground, and build a cooperative front to safeguard their national interests. U.S. goods arguing they aren't the right tool for this current moment. What we're doing again is matching what the U.S. is doing. That's fair. It's fair to match what they've done. And it puts us in a better position to focus and on exactly those sectors, work forward. So sometimes, to go back to the earlier question, you drop the gloves in the first period, when you're late in the game, dropping the gloves and taking the extra penalty might not be the best thing to do as trade tensions continue with the U.S. What could this mean for negotiations between the two countries? James Moore is a former conservative industry minister, and he joins me now. Hey, James, thanks for coming on. Pleasure's mine. How would you characterize what the Prime Minister has done here with the retaliatory tariffs? Is it a form of capitulation, a betrayal, or do you see it as, an act of goodwill to try and get a deal done? I think it's appropriate for the moment, but there's a piece of his analogy that is unknown. He says that there are times in a hockey game where you do want to go into the corners, elbows up, and maybe drop the gloves. And there's times to be more disciplined and finesse things. But at the end of the analogy that you just played right there, as he said, when you're heading toward the end of a game and it's very close, maybe you don't want to take a penalty. So the question is, are we towards the end of the game? How? The timing of all this truly speaks volumes. To understand why it carries such weight, one must look at the scale of what Donald Trump has just done. The imposition of a 50% tariff on Indian goods is not merely a number. It is a heavy blow to trade flows worth billions of dollars, while also shaking the very foundation of Washington-New Delhi relations. Until recently, the United States remained India's largest trading partner, with a total annual exchange of $212 billion. Now that relationship is visibly fracturing, and it is precisely at this moment that the name Mark Carney steps onto the stage. Carney, the Canadian economist and politician, took office in 2025 as the country's 24th Prime Minister. He had previously served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, and then as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. Clearly, Carney is not the typical politician who merely maneuvers within the confines of trade wars. He is among the few with deep expertise in the workings of global financial markets. His approach to the Canada-U.S. trade conflict is deliberate and calculated. Carney once used a down-to-earth hockey analogy. Sometimes you need to know when to jump into the fight and when to stay disciplined in order to secure long-term victory. Dropping the gloves and taking the extra penalty might not be the best thing to do. Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to lift most of the retaliatory tariffs on American goods is not an act of concession. It is a strategic move designed to keep the dialogue wide open, as long as Washington remains willing to engage. Throughout the negotiations with the United States, the Canadian government has remained steadfast in defending jobs and the interests of domestic businesses. We will continue along that path as we search for a long-term solution. Yet the reality is that the Trump administration still imposes heavy tariffs on Canada. This has produced a consequence Trump did not anticipate, a major diplomatic turning point. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has announced that Christopher Cooler will be appointed as Canada's new High Commissioner to New Delhi, ending a vacancy of nearly a year after both Ottawa and New Delhi expelled each other. Senior diplomats, this decision illustrates how tariff pressure is generated fresh momentum for the two countries to reopen channels of communication. The reason Canada-India relations had reached an impasse was not trade, but something far more serious. The Canadian government had publicly accused Indian agencies of being linked to killings and extortion on our soil, allegations that cannot simply be brushed aside. However, with the economy under threat from a 50% tariff imposed by a key trading partner, both sides are now compelled to reconsider what their vital priorities must be. India is not standing idle either. New Delhi has appointed Dinesh Patnaik, currently ambassador to Spain, as its new High Commissioner to Ottawa. Clearly, both sides are seeking ways to untangle their diplomatic deadlock in order to focus on economic interests. As Prime Minister Carney has stressed, Canada must strengthen and expand its trade relationships worldwide. This is not just a diplomatic gesture. It is an unavoidable reality. The supply chain system that Canada and the United States have built together over decades is deeply intertwined and cannot be easily separated. That is why diversifying partnerships with countries such as India will be a strategic step for the future. The difference with Canada is that those are precisely the sectors in which our economies are the most integrated. So if it's the automobile tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, softwood lumber is another example. For decades, we have integrated supply chains, just-in-time delivery. I've said before, Canada and the United States don't as much as sell things to each other, but build things together and sell them around the world. We've taken very, very tough measures, as has the United States, with respect to dumping from countries like China of steel and aluminum. So we're optimistic that we can continue to have those conversations with President Trump's administration and make the case that there's an economic opportunity for both countries if we reset some of those sectoral tariffs. Even so, the trade barriers imposed by Mr. Trump are forcing circumstances to shift. The Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminium, and copper have dealt a heavy blow to Canadian businesses, with direct consequences for jobs, as well as investment decisions across many regions of the country. What Prime Minister Carney released late last week on Friday, they were very specific in this news release and the press release that said, look, when you look at the sort of reframing of trade with America, countries around the world, our competitors in trade are paying 15%, up to 50% in some cases in terms of broad-based tariffs. But when we look at Canadian access to the U.S. America, the American market through CUSMA, most about 85 to 90% of the products we sell them are going through tariff-free. But as you've mentioned, it's those areas like steel, aluminum, copper, auto parts, those are what we call in 232 tariffs. Those are the ones that are still having a really significant tariff put on them. And that's damaging to Canadian business. Certainly our membership is feeling it at the Canadian Chamber, and we're seeing that affect jobs, affect investment decisions, and other things like that that are so critical for business. So they are damaging. But what this move does is it just to say, look, we're here with goodwill, we're negotiating with you. We're meeting you on the things we can agree on. But it's the other things like steel and aluminum that we need to focus the next step on. And that's where we see some sign of hope here, is that Canada is signaling, look, we're willing to be good partners here, but let's get to business on the parts that we can agree on. And that's steel, aluminum, copper. When one door closes, it is only natural to find a way to open another. And when the United States is no longer a reliable partner, the only option is diversification. For India, however, This shock is far more severe. Economists warn that the new tariffs could devastate India's key export industries, pushing hundreds of thousands of workers into unemployment. The gemstone diamond, shrimp export, ready-made garment and carpet manufacturing sectors, heavily dependent on American customers, are taking heavy losses. What is being lost here is not just reflected in statistics, but in the very real families, stripped of their livelihoods because of a trade war sparked by Trump. From textile mills to seafood processing plants, the risk of job losses is spreading everywhere. Traders say yet, this very factor makes the geopolitical picture all the more striking. Both Canada and India are being forced to pivot away from the U.S. market, something almost unimaginable just months ago. At home, many Canadian businesses have delayed investment plans due to uncertainty, but at the same time, they have also begun seeking customers in new regions and expanding domestic trade to reduce dependency. Yeah, so I think we've been going through this for the past 8 months. And I think this has been a challenge for business because they love to live in a world of certainty. And so what we've seen is that businesses have, in a lot of cases, have held off on making decisions, whether it be on investing in capital, investing in people, investing in their businesses, until they can get a little bit more understanding of what this looks like when you look at the broader numbers overall, from a Canadian perspective as well, and Manitoba obviously included in that. What we have seen is a decrease in exports to the United States. Typically in the past, we were somewhere in the neighborhood about 74%. I saw some main numbers that showed us about 68%. So what we're seeing is that there's being an impact on this. We're exporting less to the U.S. as a result of this. The positive is that, and one of the things that we've talked about repeatedly, is we need to explore new markets. And so we have seen an increase in trade with other jurisdictions, not to the same dollar level, but we have seen an increase in that percentage. So that's a good thing. And that's one of the things that we've continually talked about, is that when you have an unreliable trading partner, you need to start looking at other opportunities. And so some of those opportunities are existing relationships that we have with other countries. It's also about interprovincial trade barriers. How can we do more trade within Canada as well? And so these are things that businesses have been looking at to make up that loss of what's happening south of the border. But at the same time, it's not to the same extent, which is why when relations with Washington deteriorated, New Delhi was forced to pivot eastward, seeking to revive ties with Beijing, relations that have been frozen since the bloody border clash 5 years ago. Imagine this. It is Trump's tariffs that are pushing India, a key democratic partner in the Indo-Pacific, closer to China for the first time since 2018. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is preparing to visit China this week to attend a summit hosted by President Xi Jinping. The trip comes immediately after Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Indian goods, making it a particularly significant event. The scenario runs entirely counter to the diplomatic course that successive U.S. presidents had pursued. For decades, the White House had sought to build a strategic partnership with India by promoting military cooperation, facilitating technology transfers, and strengthening ties with the world's largest democracy in order to balance China's growing influence in the region. Now Trump's economic policy is shaking that foundation. The revival of Canada-India relations, therefore, is not an isolated story. It is part of a larger picture in which many countries are compelled to readjust their diplomatic and trade strategies. India is seeking to stabilize its relationship with China, much like Australia, Canada, and Japan have been doing in recent months, since Trump took office and began imposing a wave of trade barriers on both friends and allies. With extensive experience in central banking, Mark Carney understands how economic shifts can reshape global politics. He has seen firsthand how financial pressures can alter the balance of international power. Never forget trade and currency always go hand in hand. When a currency rises or falls, it determines who bears the greatest cost of tariffs. That is why Carney is seen as particularly well suited to lead Canada. In this turbulent moment, the appointment of senior diplomats is only the beginning of a broader strategy. The news of new ambassadors stems from an agreement reached between Prime Minister Carney and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the G7 summit in June. This is not a knee-jerk reaction, but a plan carefully prepared at the highest level of leadership. And Carney's vision goes beyond bilateral ties. In June 2025, when Canada hosted the 51st G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, Carney opened the event and invited world leaders, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Through these efforts, Carney has been steadily building an international coalition capable of jointly confronting economic pressure from Washington. This approach is grounded in economic logic. Canada possesses abundant energy and raw material resources, while India holds advantages in manufacturing, capacity, and a vast consumer market. As the federal government and provinces strive to strengthen national economic unity, Canada is positioning itself to launch large-scale projects that will serve long-term national interests. Behind these short-term economic calculations lies a deeper strategic meaning. Canada and India, two major democracies, have been drawn into the situation by the White House's confrontational policy, even as Washington slaps a 50% tariff on Indian goods, the highest in years, and drags bilateral relations to unprecedented lows. It is clear that Donald Trump cares more about pulling production back to U.S. than cooperating with friends. The irony is striking. He campaigned on bringing America closer to its allies, yet his policies are pushing them away. Today, only Brazil faces tariffs as steep as India's, and when a democracy like India's lumped together with a country leaning toward authoritarianism, like Brazil, that is not alliance building, it is alliance breaking for Carney. This situation contains both challenges and opportunities. The challenges are obvious. Canada must find new trade partners to compensate for lost U.S. markets, but the opportunity could be transformative. It opens the door to a more multipolar trading system, one in which middle powers like Canada and India have greater voice and autonomy. In this context, personal relationships between leaders are crucial. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi once enjoyed a close relationship with Trump during his first term, to the point that just before Trump's inauguration in 2025, Modi sent warm congratulations, expressing hope for renewed cooperation. That friendship quickly dissolved in the face of Trump's hardline economic nationalism. In a small, crowded market in New Delhi, Anand Gupta, a supplier of apparel accessories to global brands, sits quietly in his shop. Trump's harsh tariffs have devastated his business. Multiply Gupta's story by hundreds of thousands, and the scale of economic disruption created by this tariff policy becomes clear. Yet amid the chaos lies opportunity. Countries like Canada can step in, offering alternative partnerships and helping to fill the gap. That is why the appointment of Christopher Cooter carries such weight. With over 35 years of diplomatic experience, including service in New Delhi in the late 1990s, he is considered one of the most seasoned officials Ottawa could send. This is not a moment for experimentation. Canada has chosen its best to represent the country on the international stage. The impact of this crisis extends well beyond Canada. India relations experts argue that losing India would rank among the most significant strategic setbacks for the United States. Yet Trump's approach appears to be steering events precisely in that direction. When you impose a 50% tariff on a democratic ally, you not only weaken their economy, but also inadvertently push them closer to your rivals. In response, Carney has acted with both firmness and calculation. In his victory speech, he used words as sharp as a skate blade to send a message to Canada's southern neighbor. The United States is not Canada, and Canada will never under any circumstances become part of the United States. It was a direct reply to Trump's threats of tariffs and his musings about Canada becoming America's 51st state. But Carney did not stop at words. He quickly translated that message into concrete action. As Prime Minister, he abolished the federal carbon tax for Canadians, passed the One Canadian Economy Act to dismantle domestic trade barriers, and pushed forward major infrastructure projects to shield the economy from the trade war with the U.S. At the same time, Ottawa unveiled plans to significantly boost defense spending. The One Canadian Economy Act stands out as a milestone. It is designed to make Canada more self-reliant and less dependent on any single partner. Even the U.S. within the first month of his mandate, Carney's government advanced Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act. With cross-party conservative support, the law eliminates remaining federal trade barriers and accelerates national projects under direct cabinet approval. At the same time defense spending was prioritized, in February 2025, Carney